Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to session D3, which will review some common rehabilitation challenges that we see with historic rehabilitation tax credit projects and take a more in-depth look at some specific design challenges at the recently rehabilitated Worcester County Courthouse. I am Elizabeth Sherva, the Director of Architectural Review for the Massachusetts Historical Commission. Joining me today on the panel is Alyssa Augustine, Senior Architectural Historian with the Public Archaeology Lab, and Michael Lozano, Vice President of Development at Trinity Financial. I'd like to take this time to remind audience members to place your questions into the Q&A window. Please do not put questions in the chat or use the hand raise function. Alyssa, Michael, and I will do our best to answer your questions at the end of the session. As many of you may already know, the Massachusetts Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program is still considered a pilot program that was just recently extended to expire in 2027. The program has an annual cap of $55 million. The projects must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The number of applications for the Massachusetts Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program continue to rise. Even during 2020 and 2021, the MHC continued to receive a large number of reapplications and new applications. There can be many different design challenges in any given building. Each building proposed for rehabilitation is unique and provides its own set of challenges. There are some challenges that occur in many buildings, and these include stairs, guardrails, storefronts, and open volumes of space. And I will review some examples of challenges and solutions in these areas. When given design challenges, I often refer people to the NPS Technical Preservation Services page. Here, select preservation by topic. The website provides an extensive list of topics to choose from. And once you've selected a topic, the website provides links to all NPS documents and publications on that topic. Our first example is at the St. Gabriel's Monastery in Boston. The monastery was rehabilitated and converted into residential units. Here's a view of the outside of the monastery before and after rehabilitation. The project team initially proposed to infill the voids between, the monastery features an ornate stair in the center of the floor plate. The balusters are separated by horizontal members to create a unique and one-of-a-kind stair. As you can see from the pictures, the openness of the balustrade is a character-defining feature of the stair and the building, and it lets lots of light into the stairwell. The project team initially proposed to infill the voids between the vertical and horizontal members with a 5/8 inch thick wood infill panel attached to the existing railing. They had also proposed to paint the infill and original wood rail, balusters, and horizontal members with a gloss brown finish. This proposed treatment does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. By adding wood and painting the historic wood elements and new wood elements the same color, there was no differentiation between new and historic materials. Understanding that in order to meet code, the large openings between the balustrades and horizontal members must be reduced, MHC staff recommended that glazing or a mesh screening be attached to balustrades in a material that was not wood. The MHC also recommended that the wood components remain stained. The project team was able to design a system that used mesh and was attached to the vertical balustrades. The drawing here shows the proposed mesh system. This treatment meets the Secretary of the Interior standards. Here you see the finished product. The stair rail system remains open and airy while meeting current building code. Guardrails at landings are another area that can be challenging to comply with code. Here's an example of a typical guardrail that is too low to meet current code. Initially, the proposed treatment was to install a metal pipe tube handrail and post system attached directly to the top of the historic handrail. This treatment does not meet the standards. The project proponent redesigned the system to what we see here. The new railing is proposed to be affixed to the underside of the existing handrail. This treatment was approved as it meets the standards. And this project is currently under construction, so I don't have an after photo for you today. Rehabilitation of storefronts can also be challenging. Here are before and after photographs of the arcade building in Westboro. The storefronts have been heavily modified over the years. Transoms had been covered and removed. The bulkhead on one end of the facade was a different height and proportion from the other end of the facade. And additionally, there were a variety of materials. The storefront on the arcade building did retain its historic detailed columns and recessed entryways. When rehabilitating historic storefronts, it's important to take into consideration proportions and components of historic storefronts. Selective removal of inappropriate materials may provide evidence of remaining historic materials or evidence of how the historic storefronts were originally designed. If available, historic photographs can help guide the design for rehabilitation. You can see in this drawing the existing conditions prior to rehabilitation. Take note of the differing signage and bulkhead sizes. The initial proposal was off to a great start. Retractable awnings were proposed as they had historically been on the building. The bulkhead proportions were appropriate, but this proposed treatment did not meet the standards. This proposed storefront was missing transoms that were historically part of the design of the storefronts. And additionally, the doors proposed did not meet the standards. The doors proposed were standard tube-like commercial doors similar to the doors shown here. This type of door is too modern in design and does not preserve the storefront's character. Therefore, they do not meet the standards. Staff at the MHC recommended that the entrance doors be informed by the historic photograph. The historic photograph suggested a one light and one panel door with the panel the same height as the adjoining storefront bulkhead. The storefront was redesigned and, as you can see here, responded to MHC's concerns. And the proposed design met the standards. The signage band, transoms, display windows, doors, and retractable awning were all appropriate proportions and in appropriate locations. Additionally, the historic columns were integrated into the design. Here are photographs from the completed rehabilitation. As you can see, the operable awnings are being utilized. The storefront is now historically appropriate for the building. Here, I'd like you to notice the door. Imagine if the standard metal commercial door had been used. The historically appropriate door makes a huge impact on the feeling of the storefront. Finally, open volumes are a very big design challenge in rehabilitating historic buildings. The picture on the left is St. Gabriel's Church prior to rehabilitation, and on the right after rehabilitation. As you can see in this photograph, the large volume is quite impressive. Additionally, the volume has side aisles and other areas right off the main large volume. Here are views from different angles. The top left photograph shows the choir loft and the area beneath. Here you see one of the smaller areas off the large volume. The church was converted into amenity space for residents of the neighboring monastery building and other residential buildings that were part of the development. With the creative placement of furnishings, different areas are created within the space without the need for walls or partitions. One small side aisle serves as a kitchen area, while other smaller spaces off the large volume were transformed into small meeting areas. The space under the choir loft was transformed into leasing offices. A small conference room was constructed off of the main volume. The glass wall offers a slight amount of privacy while retaining the space's open relationship with the main volume. Now I'll hand it over to Michael and Alyssa to talk about the project that had lots of design challenges, including open volumes, the Worcester County Courthouse.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So you want to pull up the presentation, Alyssa? Thank you. Yeah, so I, myself, and Alyssa will present a case study of our project, which I am happy to report is just finishing, and that we have all of the units now occupied at the building, which is great, and what we were all working towards. But it has been quite the path to get to this point, and it's an incredible building. So the old Worcester County Courthouse is located at sort of the northern gateway to downtown Worcester in what is known as the Lincoln Square area. So if you go back to the previous slide, Alyssa, please. So, you know, it's an iconic, monumental building. It's at the intersection of two very prominent streets within Worcester. And was in danger of demolition for a number of years, but we're happy that we were able to put together an adaptive reuse that could be, you know, carried out, and not without its challenges, which we'll get into, but has been able to save and totally revitalize this building. So if you flip forward a couple, Alyssa, please. So we were awarded and came into the project in 2017, but as Alyssa will get into more details on, the property has quite the history. It was originally built in the 1840s and has history before that even. In 2007, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts built a new, more modern courthouse down the street. And this building became empty and mothballed for a number of years. There were a number of RFP processes to try to find a new use for this building that were, for whatever reason, unsuccessful. And eventually, the Commonwealth granted the building to the city of Worcester to continue to try to find an adequate reuse that could save the building. The city then put it out for an RFP that selected a developer. That developer was not able to perform, and for a number of reasons, or for whatever reason, and eventually Trinity came into the project, and we were fortunate enough to be able to put together a redevelopment plan that could work. And we are just, as I mentioned, we are just finishing now. So really it was a public-private partnership. There was elements of the state, very much a enormous amount of participation by the city of Worcester and support for this project. And then we, as the private developer, you know, put together the resources in order to pull this off. Ultimately, the building has been converted into 118 units of mixed income rental apartments. Apartments range in affordability from, and for households for households that earn as low as 30% of area median income. There's a tier at 60% of area median income, one at 80%, a workforce housing tier for individuals that earn up to 110% of area median income, and then a number of apartments are unrestricted market rate. So we truly have something for everybody within this new community. We also have built a museum that honors Marshall Major Taylor, who at the turn of the last century was one of the first African Americans to be champion of any sport. He was a world champion bicycle racer, bicyclist. And he was forgotten for many years. He spent his formative years in the city of Worcester and is a famous son, a favorite son of the city. And we worked with the city and many others within the city to create a publicly accessible museum space honoring the life and achievements of Major Taylor. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. Our project utilized state and federal historic tax credits, which is why we are here. It utilized both state and federal low-income housing tax credits. It utilized other state affordable housing subsidy sources, as well as some sources from the city of Worcester, as well as debt and equity. So it had a very complicated financing structure. Alyssa, you can go to the next slide, please. Can you advance one, Alyssa? Oh, did we lose one? Oh, there we go. So some of the big picture challenges, and Alyssa will get into the more details of these challenges, but it is an enormous building. Again, it was built for a completely different use from what we are utilizing it for today. There were very large and irregular floor plates within this building. It was built, and Alyssa will get into this, it was built in 4 different stages over its lifetime. That proved to be quite difficult to convert to housing to get the proper sort of floor plates and dimensions for residential uses. But what that did provide us with was incredible spaces to reutilize. And we have every single apartment within this building is different. There is no stacking. There are no sort of similarities between the different types of apartments. They are all truly unique, and we were able to utilize many of the historic details within the apartments themselves, which has really added to the uniqueness and the flavor of the building. We have monumental spaces that we had to reutilize. This is an image of one of the courtrooms, one of the most prominent courtrooms, which through quite a process, we eventually were able to reutilize as an apartment space. Many of the courtroom spaces we reutilized for amenity spaces. Some others we were able to divide up into smaller apartments, but many of the original courtrooms we kept in their entirety, and you can see that here. And lastly, it was very costly construction. It was a difficult, as I mentioned, it was a difficult and complicated financing structure that we had to put together. But the construction itself, in order to preserve this building, was very costly. But fortunately, we were able to utilize the historic tax credits to offset that cost, and ultimately we were successfully able to do this. So I'll turn it over to Alyssa, and you can get a little bit more into the details of what we've been working with here.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to get into 3 fairly specific design challenges that we faced in the courthouse. Before I do that, I just want to give a brief history of the construction and development of the site. So as Mike mentioned, we were dealing with a building that was constructed in 4 iterations. The earliest, the 1843 to 45 courthouse in the lower right-hand corner. This was designed by Ami B. Young. And a fairly small floor plate. And of course, as the city expanded into the 1870s, a second addition was required. You can see it right to the rear of the 43 courthouse. This was designed by Stephen C. Earle in the Greek Revival style, and it provided some additional office space, a probate court, and law libraries. The first fairly significant addition is the 1898 main block. You can see in green here to the north. This edition was designed by Andrews, Jacques, and Ratul, and it incorporated the 1840s courthouse into the overall plan and provided a registry of deeds and probate, criminal, and civil courts. And then to the rear of the 19th century buildings, we have the 1955 annex. This addition almost doubled the square footage of the overall building, and it provided frontage on Harvard Street and included a cafeteria, superior, and district courtrooms. And here's some historic maps. You can see the development and how the footprint of the courthouse has expanded all the way to the 1950s. Okay, so our first case study, as Mike mentioned earlier, is courtroom 6 in the 1843 to 45 courthouse. Again, you can see it's on the second floor of the building in the lower right-hand corner. In 2017, when we started this project with Trinity and TAT, we didn't have a specific use for this courtroom. It was one of 12 overall courtrooms in the entire building. We knew that we had to keep a certain number accessible to the public, and those that we were able to subdivide into units, we still had to be careful and maintain the overall volume and the feeling of those spaces. So a lot of square footage to consider. So in our initial Part 2 application, we just said that the space would be retained. We hadn't determined an exact use at that point, but we knew that we had to keep the courtroom furniture, so the judge's bench, the counsel tables. Of course, as you saw in the earlier photographs, there's a significant amount of wood trim and door and window casings, coffered panels on the ceiling. So we just needed some time to sort of internally develop what that space would be. Although in the background, we always kind of knew we needed a unit to make the cost viable. So in August of 2018, we submitted our first amendment that updated the scope, where we proposed the unit. We attempted to maintain the overall volume again, but we introduced some bathrooms and closets along the west wall, and we also had a kitchen down here. Single bedroom unit, we utilized the rear judge's chamber. We kept all the original furniture and of course all of the other features as I just mentioned. But it was too much of a build out for MHC and the Park Service. Just too many introductions of new features. So we were asked to go back to the drawing board, and it took us about a year before we came back with what we felt was a fairly solid scope. So in September 2019, we submitted another amendment. This time we were proposing a 2-bedroom unit. So we took advantage of the rear hallway and the rear judge's chamber. You can see to the right. And within the space, we completely eliminated the bathroom and the closets that were up in this corner. And we reduced the height of the island in the kitchen. So when you're standing in this space, as you saw in that earlier photograph, your vision is not impacted by any new demising walls or any new rooms or modern features. And this got approved. So here are some before and after photographs. Just a complete transformation, and it's breathtaking. Of course, it's a private unit, but it was really well done space. And here is the rear judge's chamber and corridor. This right here is the access point from the courtroom. And the bedrooms you see today. So the next case study I want to talk about are the Main Street doors at the center of the 1898 main block, the east elevation. So these doors initially were proposed to be pinned closed and inoperable. Obviously they're incredibly heavy. I wanted to get a weight. Mike, I'm not sure if you know how much they weigh, but obviously we can't use them today. And even initially, I think historically they were pinned open. So we were just going to pin them closed, and a feature that you could see from the street and internally. But over the course of the project and construction, this entrance we needed to reuse it as a point of egress. The circulation patterns were revisited. So, oh, I'm sorry. I also meant to add that during construction, there was this beautiful copper trim that was stolen. The date plaque above the doors was retained, but that was removed at some point, unfortunately. So TET came up with a really brilliant plan to make this entrance accessible. We used this church in England as a point of reference. They installed these fully glazed frameless doors and pinned the doors open. So the fabric is there, but it's still a point of egress. And it was successfully approved and welcomed with open arms by MHC and the Park Service. And you can see up close, it's just phenomenal. And by incorporating the glass, you can even see the starburst transoms on the interior. Just came out really beautifully, and the doors were restored. So yeah, so glass, it's a theme in these case studies. And finally, we have the stairs. In the courthouse, I want to say we had around 30 staircases to deal with and figure out how we'd either reuse them, or did we need to use those floor plates for units or other amenity spaces. So of those 30 stairs, we kept about 15. And of those 15, 2 we secured variances for, so there were no impacts whatsoever to the fabric. And the rest we had to bring up to code or seal off from the public. So this stair is in the 1878 edition. It provided access between the first and second floors of the 2 law libraries. It's my favorite stair. It's the copper. It's just a gorgeous feature. And originally it was going to be reused as a stair, the whole feature. And we were going to build a freestanding guardrail system inboard of the handrail to bring it up to code. The issue though, at the top landing, you have this other stair, this half stair that provided access to the rear libraries, which that wouldn't have been accessible from the main floor plate. So I think we had one iteration where we completely removed this run and we built a ramp. But the last iteration that we landed on and that was approved, we proposed keeping that run, just building the ramp right over it. So the stair right here, you can see it's in the back and the ramp runs right up from the base. And we also made sure that this stair, we didn't want to bring it up to code. We didn't necessarily need it to provide access between these 2 levels. So tempered glass was installed at the first and second floor landings. And at the second floor, it's accessible. This stair, stair 21, is in courtroom 4, I believe, of the 1898 main building. This courtroom is one of the spaces that was retained as a tenant amenity space. Of course, this double run provided access to these doors up top. So we needed to figure out how do we keep the stair and not provide access to any spaces that residents or the public really shouldn't be going up to. So again, no variances were needed for this. We just sealed those doors shut at the second floor landing, and then tempered glass was installed with an aluminum shoe at each side of the curved run. So it's still this really gorgeous feature inside this space that can be enjoyed by tenants. It's just not accessible. And then finally, this space is in the annex. Bottom right here is the main entrance lobby, and today it's being reused as the main resident entryway. So we needed to both bring this stair up to code, and it also had to be an accessible entrance. So you can see, sorry, I don't mean to advance yet. The stair, we had, marble everywhere. The guardrails were wide open, children can fall right through those spaces. So again, we installed the tempered glass system. So you can see through, it doesn't really impede your view of the stair or of the space, and the original features were fully retained. And to make it accessible, we cut into one of the marble bases. So you can see it here at the landing, and then right as soon as you enter. And it's just a lift, fairly unobtrusive. And, you know, the space just looks magnificent. And that's it. So I'll pass it back on to Mike to talk about Major Taylor.
Yeah, so and you know what we've shown today was just a small sampling of the things that our team had to deal with. There are probably hundreds of additional ones that we were very ably, thanks to our team, able to deal with, as well as with MHC and the Park Service. It was quite the collaboration. But we'll end our presentation and then turn it over for questions on just a little introduction to the Major Taylor Museum, which I mentioned. So again, this is a space that is honoring Marshal Major Taylor. So originally, the city of Worcester really wanted to have a publicly accessible space within the building, and they originally envisioned that as retail. But as you've seen, this building it barely lends itself to residential, let alone retail. It's set back far from the street. It has this monumental architecture. Retail is not a really great use or feasible use within this building. But we still wanted to provide the city what they really desired, which was to activate this part of Main Street and provide, not have it closed off just as a residential property, but have a publicly accessible space within the building. So we were able to accomplish sort of the two tracks, which was to honor Major Taylor, but also provide the public access into this space. So we utilized one of the historic spaces within the building. We've transformed it into this approximately just under 2,000 square foot museum. It's got interactive exhibits. It tells the life story of Major Taylor and how he learned his trade and became a world champion as he lived and enjoyed his time in Worcester. And this is now, will be having a grand opening next month. And we will be inviting the public into this space on a very regular basis. So we will end our session, our presentation there, and we will turn it over to questions. So I'm just looking at the chat now, and I see a couple of questions here. So the first one is, how large is the museum and what percentage of the total space is it? Was the public access a required component? So the museum is just under 2,000 square feet. The building itself is well over 200,000 square feet. So it's a relatively small, but very important, and in fact, one of the more prominent locations within the building. There was a requirement initially within the RFP that there be a publicly accessible space within the building. The city was very amenable to all sorts of ideas to meet that. They were, as I mentioned, were really quite incredible throughout this entire process. They understood what it was going to take to pull off a project like this, and they worked with us every step of the way, including on being flexible about how we provided that public access component.
Looks like we have another question in the Q&A. Did you have to insert new stairs or elevators to make up for those that were closed off?
We only introduced one new stair in the sort of at the intersection of the 1878 and 1955 annex. The rest of the stairs, especially in the annex, accessed almost every level. So it was more a matter of making sure the stairs that we did have were accessible. So we introduced some ramps in other locations in the building, but just the one. Luckily, those 30 stairs we were able to pick and choose somewhat.
And Alyssa, you may want to explain that there was an elevator bank in the 1955 annex that you were able to utilize.
Oh, yep. The elevator bank and the elevator in the 1898 main block too.
Yeah.
That was obviously a later addition.
Yeah, so we were able to reutilize sort of the elevator cores that existed both in the annex as well as the older part of the building. We completely rebuilt the infrastructure within the elevator shafts, which was, fortunate because, we needed to preserve those spaces. And if we had to get into more structural changes, it would have made it even more difficult. But we did have to introduce a number of lifts in order to provide total accessibility through the building, which we now have. The building had never been accessible in its history. So now it's fully accessible to all locations.
We've got another question. Was the 1955-56 block straightforward to convert by comparison? And were there any special problems for that time period?
Amazingly, no. It was also incredibly difficult. It lent itself much better to a conversion to residential because of its sort of design and its floor plate, but it introduced its own sort of set of complications. It had significant hazardous materials utilized throughout it, which we had to abate, and that was another place where we worked very closely with the city on. But also the spaces, it had the same sort of monumental spaces. And in fact, its more modern construction in some ways, I think, was more difficult to work with. Alyssa, maybe you can elaborate on that some.
No, the first thing I think of is the amount of courtrooms that were in the annex.
Yeah.
I think there were at least 6 or 7, and of all different sizes. I mean, there were some that were divided into 2 units and others, that were half the size, but still the ceiling height, all of that had to be taken into consideration when TET was designing the build out.
And a jail.
Yes.
The jail, yeah, we have one unit where there was a holding cell between 2 of the courtrooms on the 2nd and 4th floors. And we retained a few of those cell bars and pinned them to the walls in 2 units, which I'm hearing aren't really welcome additions by some tenants, but
Yeah.
We have a detail level question.
Yeah.
How you pinned those heavy doors open in a historically acceptable way. Was it by stays, braces, or stops, or concealed at the hinges?
Concealed at the hinges, I believe, which I want to say it took quite a while to get those doors installed. Obviously with COVID, there was a significant delay in materials, and but I think the hinges were the last thing that arrived on site. You might correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. That was just about the last thing that arrived on site. And it was, our construction was occurring during COVID almost entirely. So that introduced its own set of challenges, but we had a lot of issues with hardware at the very end of the job. And luckily, eventually we were able to take care of that.
Another question, windows are so often a challenge with historic tax credit projects. Can you talk about any challenges you've faced and solutions you used here? Alyssa, do you remember how many types of windows were here at the courthouse. And not only just operable windows, you also had a large amount of ornate starburst windows in different shapes.
We did, yeah. In this building, which I thought was unique, all of the original windows to the 1898 main block, 1878 edition, and the 55 annex were still on site. So the first challenge was, providing that window survey and making sure that Park Service and MHC were comfortable with us replacing and not restoring. So that was a larger hurdle to get over at the early stages of the project. We decided early on that because there is so much stained trim on the interior, that aluminum clad wood would be the best approach for the 19th century buildings. Luckily at TAT, really, they took hold of dealing with the window manufacturers and making sure that the shop drawings we submitted were on par. Once we got the shop drawings, there wasn't a lot of back and forth. We did have to use 2 separate manufacturers to give us the aluminum clad and then the aluminum, basic storefront systems in the annex. The one issue I remember going back and forth with the Park Service on was the width of the mullions and how our demising unit walls would meet those mullions and they wouldn't be visible from the exterior. That took a few weeks to get to a point where Joellen was satisfied. But they look fantastic. And then the starburst windows that Elizabeth mentioned, as well as the leaded glass windows in the grand stair, those were refurbished. So they're original features that are still in the building.
And I think there's a question in the chat, not necessarily in the Q&A, but the question is, can you speak to the environmental sustainability challenges with adhering to the historic tax credits? So that was, again, it was always our goal, and it's always our goal to provide the highest level of sustainability in our projects. I think the number one thing we could do as it relates to sustainability is to save this building.
Mm-hmm.
It is in an urban location, it's transit oriented. If this building for whatever reason became a parking lot like so many other buildings did, history of this building, wouldn't necessarily be very environmentally friendly. So just the fact that we were able to save this building and reutilize it for housing, I think, is maybe the most sustainable thing that we could do. But in all of the window work, which we were just talking about, all of the windows were single glazed, very inefficient. By utilizing more efficient windows where we could, that alone was quite sustainable. We replaced all of the systems within the building. So all of the HVAC systems are completely new and highly efficient. But it's a challenge. It's still a challenge. It's not as efficient construction type as if we were building brand new, but wherever we could introduce new insulation, we absolutely did. And I think that we've performed quite well, and we actually have been able to utilize some energy rebates on behalf of the construction that we were able to do. I don't know, Alyssa, if you want to mention any of the challenges related to any of those things from a historic standpoint, or Elizabeth, how you see that come across your desk.
The biggest thing for us is the insulation and how, in Massachusetts, we can add up to 4 inches, and that includes the whole system. So, as part of that, the cost of the project, all of that trim had to be removed and retained and reinstalled, tagged to make sure you're reinstalling it in the correct locations. Had to pay attention to the relationship between the new wall insulation and the depth of the window openings on the interior. I can't stress enough, TAT was absolutely amazing on this project, and they handled, I'm sure a lot of things came up that just weren't brought to my attention. They just handled it amazingly, and they still are.
So this is somewhat related. Did you save the original plaster walls or replace with modern gypsum wallboard?
In the courtrooms that are that were retained as sort of amenity spaces for tenants, in those locations, the plaster was saved and the surfaces were repainted. And we engaged John Canning to provide a paint analysis of all of the monumental spaces to make sure that the paint type and color that we were proposing were suitable matches to the time period. And then in the other locations, for example, that first courtroom that we discussed, GWB was installed just to meet that, so the walls could be insulated.
We have a question about the Spooner painting in the main stairwell of the 1898 building.
Yeah, so to our knowledge, everything of value that the city saw was removed from the building prior to our involvement. That said, there were hundreds of architectural details, sort of remnants of the former use of the courthouse that remained when we got in there. Some things we were able to save, some things we were able to refurbish and reutilize. Some of the light fixtures, for example, there are telephone booths from the 1950s that we refurbished and retained. There are no telephones in them. We don't really need that, but we did retain those. There were other architectural details or sort of built-in furniture that we have retained and will stay in the basement until we can maybe find a use for it. Some of the historic bookcases we were able to refurbish and reutilize as furniture in some of the spaces, and other stuff we salvaged as much as we could with outside parties. But it was quite the task just to catalog everything that was in there and use whatever we could within the building. But all of the artwork had been removed long before we got involved.
I think an interesting piece of this rehabilitation was the condition the building was in at the beginning. So people understand that. I know that one of the times that I was in the building, water had come through the roof and there was basically a ice rink in the main lobby. So there was certainly pieces that I'm very impressed that were able to be saved.
Yes. It stood empty for 10 years, and I will say that the state and the city both did what they could to sort of preserve the building, keep people from breaking into it. Although I will say that there was quite a bit of urban exploring that had occurred in the couple of years right before we got involved.
Yeah.
So it is really quite remarkable that as much was able to be salvaged as we did. But really, it's made the project that much better, in all honesty.
Any unusual components to funding stack other than the historic tax credits, low income housing tax credits, debt and equity?
I think that was was really the most of it. I will say that there was, I mentioned some of the work that the city and state had done. So that as part of the conveyance of the project from the state to the state actually granted to the city $3 million to both preserve and maintain the building until someone could come along, luckily us, to reuse the building, but also to do much of that environmental abatement. So the city was able to do much of the asbestos and other hazardous material abatement before we even got there, which was enormously helpful. And then they worked with us once we got in there to deal with some of the unforeseen conditions related to that. So that was one of the more unusual pieces, and it didn't really translate into the capital stack for us, but it was absolutely necessary for the preservation of this building. So we thank the state for that.
Great. Not seeing any more questions. I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in and thanking Michael and Alyssa for joining me on this panel today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.